Hello, I'm Jonathan Howard, product developer for drinks here at the Co-op. As part of my role, I look after the tea and coffee. We're here to talk to you about coffee today, and in particular, the benefit that Fairtrade adds to the world of coffee. Today, I'm joined by Hannah, who's one of our coffee buyers within our supply base at Finlays.
Thank you for having me, Johnny. So I'm Hannah. I'm what's known in the industry as a green coffee buyer. And that essentially means that I'm sourcing coffee from producer countries that grow coffee, or in the case of the Co-op, where we're directly sourcing coffee from Fairtrade cooperatives. We're importing that coffee into our factory in the north of England. We're roasting the coffee to unlock all of those wonderful sort of aromatics and flavours of the coffee, and then we're packing it on behalf of the Co-op.
Co-op have been pioneering in the world of Fairtrade coffee for over 26 years now. Back in 2003, we sourced all of our coffee on Fairtrade terms for our Co-op own label product. We're going to talk to you today about coffee that we sourced from Matira in Kenya. This cooperative is right at the front of climate crisis, and if we continue at the rate that we are, by 2050 they won't be able to farm coffee on these lands anymore. We're going to cut to a VT now that's going to kindly show you about the cooperative itself.
For many of us, coffee has become an essential part of our lives. But for the people who produce it, life can hang in the balance due to market fluctuations and increasingly the climate. Smallholder farmers in the global south, like those at Matira, are already deeply affected by climate change. But Fairtrade is making a huge difference, offering a guaranteed minimum price and premium, so they are better equipped to protect the environment they farm in.
Last week it rained, so there were hailstones. We never used to have them. COP UK in Fairtrade trained us about climate change. We were given good coffee varieties which were resistant to these extreme hot and extremely cold. Most farmers which are getting losses for the last 15 years, but us, through being trained by Fairtrade and COP UK, our production are increasing rather than going down. I thank the Fairtrade and COP UK. Prices are good. I'm getting good income. I'm living a comfortable life through coffee farming.
That's why at Co-op, all our own label coffee has been Fairtrade since 2003. And wherever we use coffee as an ingredient, our producers benefit. The climate crisis is happening now for coffee farmers. As it decreases yields, farmers are often forced to deforest more land to survive. Without action, as much as half the land used for coffee won't be suitable for farming by 2050. Co-op is playing our part to tackle the climate crisis and to reach net zero by 2040. Partnering with Fairtrade Africa, climate justice is at the heart of our plan, putting people and planet first and empowering producers to tackle climate change to secure their future livelihoods.
So we would like to call all of you, we come together and help us tackle this climate change because of our generation and more generations which are coming. Thank you.
It's amazing to see the benefit that Fairtrade pricing brings to coffee growers all the way over across the world, especially in Matira in Kenya, where they're so heavily influenced by the climate crisis that we currently see with us today. So Hannah's now going to be able to take us through the wonderful world of coffee, talking about the various species that are available, where it's grown, and also the different types.
Thank you, Johnny. So there's over 120 known species of coffee, but most aren't commercially viable when it comes to being a global crop species because maybe the quality isn't there, they don't yield enough coffee, or they're not resistant enough to the environment in terms of being maybe sort of resistant to disease and infestation. But there are two species that are sort of commercially viable and make up over 99% of the world coffee supply, and they're more commonly referred to as Arabica and Robusta. So if we focus on Arabica, as a general rule of thumb, Arabica is grown higher up the mountain, and at higher elevation, the temperatures are a lot cooler, and that really slows down the growth cycle of the coffee tree and the cherries. It gives the cherry a lot more time to absorb nutrients, and it really sort of breaks down those sugars and concentrates those flavors. So you can expect to find a lot of complexity and nuance in your cup of Arabica. And of course, Arabica makes up your foundation of the specialty industry. So you've got really nice quality coffee. You can, of course, expect to pay a little bit more for it, but you don't necessarily get more caffeine for the privilege. So Arabica, generally speaking, has around 1% caffeine. So if we contrast that with Robusta, as the name suggests, it's very robust. So it's a hardier shrub than Arabica. And that means you can grow it at lower elevation. So lower down the mountain, there's typically more threat from insects, But Robusta has sort of evolved in a way that it's got twice the caffeine content of Arabica at 2%, and caffeine is a very bitter compound, and that acts as sort of a natural bug repellent. So it will yield more cherries, as you generally find that's what happens lower down the mountain, but those cherries won't have the same complexity as perhaps your Arabica. So it won't have all those sort of prized flavour attributes that you find with Arabica, but it definitely brings something to the table. It's obviously got twice the caffeine content, so it lends more of a kind of kick to your blends. It's also got a very sort of creamy, full body, and it lends itself really well to sort of espresso blends where you want that really nice golden crema on top of your espresso. So they're sort of the key differences between Arabica and Robusta. And then if we kind of contextualize that within the co-op range, so we've got sort of truly irresistible and limited edition here. They're all 100% Arabica and what we call single origin coffees. So we're buying coffee from one specific origin, and actually we go a step further with the co-op and we buy from a specific Fairtrade cooperative. And then maybe like the core range has sort of a mix of the two. So it's predominantly Arabica, but we do have a little bit of Robusta in there just to help with making that blend sort of richer and fuller bodied and stronger tasting. So if we look at where coffee is grown, we have this band of latitudes between the tropics of Cancer and Capricorn, where you have the ideal sort of growing conditions for coffee. So coffee likes sort of temperate tropical conditions, rich fertile soil, plentiful rain all year round, and obviously sort of good levels of sunlight. So countries that sort of sit along those belts have those conditions. And if it sits on the equator, like for instance, Colombia and Kenya, they'll have plentiful rain all year round, and they might have 2 harvests. Whereas if you go to some of the countries sort of north or south of the equator, like Brazil, they'll have sort of more distinct dry and rainy seasons, and they'll just have the 1 harvest. Now, those band of latitudes that I was speaking about is more affectionately known in the industry as the bean belt. And there's sort of 3 key producer regions that sit across that belt. So the first is Latin America, home to one of the most prolific coffee producing regions in the world, Brazil. It's an absolute powerhouse of coffee production and single-handedly produces 40% of world supply. And Latin American coffees typically are sort of very nutty, chocolatey in flavour. They sort of have medium body, medium acidity. So they lend themselves really well to those light roasts, but also those darker roasts as well, like your Italian and your intense blends. And these coffees also cut really well through milk and sugar. Moving on to our next continent, Africa. So, home to Kenya and Ethiopia. So Kenyan we're going to taste a bit later. Ethiopian, of course, being the birthland of coffee. And they present something really quite different to your Latin American coffees. So they've got lots of lively acidity. They've got these really fruity, floral top notes. And when we taste our Kenyan in a moment, Kenyan is very buttery and it's got really sort of citrusy, zesty top notes. So really nice coffees. And then the last producer region is Asia Pacific. So ranging anywhere between Indonesia, India, Vietnam, Laos and Papua New Guinea, all origins that we've got in the co-op range. These coffees are typically very spicy, sort of full-bodied, really nice chocolate notes, but quite smoky as well. So, a Sumatran might have really nice notes of tobacco leaf and really sort of, spicy flavours. So we've spoken a little bit about where coffee is grown. Now let's speak about how it's grown. So coffee starts out life as what is effectively a shrub. It looks like a coffee tree. And it bears what looks like cherries, so fruit. And inside of those cherries, you get 2 seeds, they sit side by side, and these are our sort of coffee beans. So it doesn't matter where you are in the world, coffee will start out life in the same way. So a farmer will plant a seed, and then perhaps sort of 3 or 4 years later, you'll get your first exportable harvest. But before you get to that point, the shrub has to sort of produce fruit, if you like. And before it can do that, it has to flower. So we need plenty rain. That will produce the flowering. And then when the flowers fall to the floor, you'll start to have a coffee cherry grow in its place. And it might take about 9 months for it to sort of fully mature and develop. And it will turn from a green colour to a bright red or a bright yellow. And that indicates that it's ripe and it's ready for picking. So throughout sort of the coffee world, there are predominantly two ways that you can harvest coffee. You can selectively hand-pick coffee, or you can use mechanized harvesting. So if we go across to sort of Colombia and Kenya, where the average smallholder farmer might have anywhere between 1 and 3 hectares of land, all of the family might work that land, and because it's kind of manageable and it's a bit smaller, they can afford to hand-pick only the ripest coffee. Of course, this is more labor-intensive and expensive, but it produces a really nice quality coffee. You go across to Brazil, sort of in contrast, where the technified farms are sort of more like 40 hectares, and the topography of the land is very different, it's very flat. That lends itself really well to mechanized harvesting. So mechanized harvesters obviously sort of strip the coffee from the tree a lot quicker than sort of you or I can do that. So output and yields go up, which is why Brazil is kind of the prolific producer that it is today. But perhaps you compromise a little bit on quality. So that's sort of the trade-off between the two processes. But generally speaking, hand-picking produces better quality coffee. So once the harvest is complete, the coffee cherry moves on to the next stage of the journey. So we spoke about a coffee cherry sort of housing 2 green coffee beans earlier. And obviously we have to separate the cherry from those coffee beans. So there's predominantly one of 2 ways that we can do this. If you go to, for instance, Brazil or Vietnam, they will dry process their coffee. So this is known as the natural method or the dry method. And essentially, the farmers sort of lay their coffee cherries out on a drying patio for anywhere between 2 and 4 weeks. They let them dry naturally in the sun, and the result will be something like this. So this is your dried coffee cherry, and inside of here you have 2 coffee beans. Then if we move across to countries like Colombia and Kenya, they will wet process their coffee. Here we go, wet process, otherwise known as the washed process. So farmers will mechanically scrub that sort of pulpy, fruity flesh away from the coffee. They'll submerge it into a water tank for anywhere between 24 and 48 hours. And the resultant coffee looks like this. So this is our green coffee with a layer of parchment. So this kind of skin around it is called parchment. And this will result in a coffee that has more aromatics, but perhaps less body. Whereas the process that we spoke about earlier, the dry process, will have more body, but perhaps less aromatics. So the final part of the process is for the farmer to deliver their coffee to a dry mill. And then the dry mill will sort this green coffee on sort of size, density, colour, and remove any defects, and then they'll get it ready for export. So as you can see, it's green in nature, and that's why I'm known in the industry as a green coffee buyer. So now they've exported their coffee, we import it obviously into our factory in the UK. And then the final part of the flavour picture is to develop a roast that really teases out sort of the best origin characteristics of that coffee. And that's where we'll work with Johnny. So let's take our Kenyan, which we'll be tasting a bit later on. So, you know, I know there's lots of complexity in this cup, lots of sort of zesty, citrusy notes, and I want a profile that's really going to sort of maximize those flavors. So I'll probably opt for a light roast and a really quick roast. Whereas if we look at something like our intense blend over here, we're going to take that a little bit darker. We're going to roast it slower and for longer so that you get sort of really rich, smoky flavors. So yeah, the final part of the picture is to develop a roast profile with the coffee in mind. So earlier we shone a spotlight on a very particular producer group, Matera in Kenya. So Johnny, now I think we're going to do a bit of a masterclass, aren't we?
Yeah, let's pull together a brew up with a French press. So roast and ground is the most popular format that we sell here at Co-op. So it's perfectly ideal, ready to rock and roll, perfect for a French press. So I think that's probably where we start. Should we grab the equipment?
Yeah, lovely. So ideally you might preheat your cafetiere. So we sort of did this earlier. So just pour a little bit of boiling water in there and let it out. The ideal sort of temperature of water is anywhere between sort of 92 and 96 degrees Celsius. So, you know, if you want to boil it to 100 degrees and then sort of let it cool down for about a minute, you've got sort of the perfect temperature. And an ideal brewing ratio is about 15 grams to 250 ml of water. So I've got a single serve cafetiere here. I'm going to use a scooped dessert spoon. And generally speaking, you'll use about one of these for every cup that you want to make. And then I'm going to fill that to the top, like so.
And when we talk about brew ratios, what we actually talk about is especially when you start talking to a barista within a coffee bar, they'll start talking about 1 to 5, 1 to 6, 1 to 7, 1 to 8, 1 to 9, 1 to 10 ratios. And what this refers to is 1 gram of coffee to 1 milliliter of water effectively. So ideally, for a French press, you're looking at a 1 to 10, 1 to 13 would probably be the ideal kind of ratios. And what typically you find is that the more lighter blends, which this from Materia we've really lightly roasted. So again, this is better on the lighter, on the sort of the lower end of the spectrums in terms of ratios. So yeah, 1 to 10 is probably perfect for this blend effectively. Let it sit for about 4 minutes.
Yeah, I'd say sort of anywhere between 4 and 5 minutes, but it's completely at your preference. So I guess whilst this is brewing, we could move over to cold brew maybe?
Yeah, so obviously the classic way that most people drink coffee is a hot brew. We're going to show you something that's cold brew. It's a big trend, especially in Australia, America in particular at the moment, and we've also seen it influence into Asia. So where you start off with some whole beans, and then you're wanting to ground them really coarsely. So they want to look like this effectively. So if you've got a hand grinder at home, going as low in setting as possible, so like a 6 is perfectly ideal. And then what you wanted to do here is you wanted to get a 1 to 4, 1 to 5 ratio in terms of coffee. So similar to what Hannah's just done, we're looking for 1 full heat teaspoon, a dessert spoon even of coffee into our French press. And then we then add water to this, like so. So just cold water. And then effectively you then leave this to extract over the course of the evening, or ideally 24 hours. And the benefit of this is, especially for those that don't like bitterness, especially within coffee, the cold brew extraction methodology allows for a lighter, more flavorful coffee to come through. You get more of the acidity, more of the brightness. You don't get as much of the bitterness. And actually, weirdly, it's a lot sweeter. So effectively, we leave that to stand and to steep is what we refer to. So where the coffee effectively absorbs the water, starts to bloom, and then it stews out and it extracts all those flavor profiles into the coffee itself. So we leave that, put the lid on, and then that goes in the fridge, ideally for 24 hours. So a bit of a Blue Peter moment here. Here's one I made earlier. So again, as you see, the coffee's actually got a little bit bigger now, and that's because the coffee's bloomed itself. So we're just going to press this down, extracting all that lovely coffee. And when I made this up yesterday, we started off with a really light color, as you saw previously. And then you get to this nice dark color, which is almost the same as what a hot brew would be. So we start off with that. And then, because this materia...
I think we've had about 4 minutes here, so
Nice.
I'm going to do mine as well.
Brew?
Yeah.
So, because Materia is such a nice, bright, acidic blend, where it's got loads of citrus, there's a nice undertone of lemongrass that we pull out, and we talk about this on pack, but I think there's definitely a lot more in there, because there's so much natural acidity and citrus within that really comes out in the cold brew. We've paired this alongside some ice. There is an orange finely sliced into there. There is a couple of slices of grapefruit and there's a couple of slices of lemon. We then pour out our cold brew into a jug, like so. And you're looking for about 2/3 of the jug to be filled. And we start there, so we've got a nice still drink currently. And then to really elevate this for a nice, great brunch dish is we just add a bit of spritz. So we've got our soda water. Just top this up, add this into the jug, just gives a nice little spritz perfectly. Nice, just a little tingle on the tongue, helps to elevate the citrus even more. And hey presto, perfect for brunch, especially in those summer months, like citrusy flavor notes, really elevates the coffee.
Looks amazing.
Super on trend, so it's a big trend within Asia and Australia in particular, where they really like to bring together citrus notes and citrus fruits alongside coffee at the moment, even served like this on the go. And you can also, in some instances, start to buy it in cans over in Asia in particular. So it's fantastic. So 2 fantastically great ways to try your coffee. Should we try?
Yeah, let's.
You go for a nice hot brew. I'm going to go for a nice
Right.
cold.
So with mine, I'm sort of expecting really vibrant, winey notes. Sort of those top notes are sort of citrus and maybe sort of lemon zest, and some sort of dark berry fruits on the finish.
And mine, the citrus tends to come out a lot more, so you get a lot more orange. It's definitely a little bit of hint of the lemongrass coming through, and you get almost like a milk chocolatey kind of flavour profile coming through. So there's a lot less bitterness in there, and yeah, just fantastic. Perfect.
More balanced and rounded.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Fairtrade's the gold standard for co-op. It puts the planet, farmers at the heart of everything that it does. That's why we're so committed to Fairtrade. So for Fairtrade Fortnight, why not get out and try our range of coffee, tea and chocolate. And thanks Hannah for coming in and for sharing your wonderful knowledge with us today.
Very welcome, and thank you very much for having me.
No worries. Cheers all.
Cheers.